It is another episode of Getting to Know Seahawks Twitter, and this time I am joined by a man from the website known as Pro Football Focus. His name is Eric Eager, Eric_PFF on Twitter. Eric, thank you so much for joining me, man. This is a long time coming.
Paul, thank you for having me on, and Seahawks Twitter being one of the best Twitters. This is a pleasure.
It might be the best Twitter, definitively. I really loved our first interaction because I'm one of those running back truthers, and I know that there's a lot of people, specifically Seahawks fans, that don't play that. But ever since our first interaction, really come to enjoy some of the stuff that you've been bringing to the table. And I'm very curious as to what you're thinking right now as the Seahawks go through a transition, specifically on the offensive side of the football.
Yeah, man, it's interesting, right? Because we got to see sort of Russell Wilson in his full glory the first, 8 or 9 games of the season. And then obviously over the second half of the year, I think spooked probably by losses, to Arizona and, games they probably should have won. They sort of put the clamps down a little bit on the offense as far as the aggressiveness. And then, they finished actually pretty strong. I mean, I think the average fan would be probably pretty surprised to know that the Seahawks won 12 games. But then, that came to a halt, in a matchup that really isn't the best matchup for them against the Los Angeles Rams. And so, now without Brian Schottenheimer in the building, they're going to be looking towards, trying to rebuild that offense this offseason. Having Russell Wilson, though, is a good start.
If you were in the Seahawks shoes, would you have moved on from Brian Schottenheimer, or as some have surmised, if Brian Schottenheimer left the Seahawks, what would you end up doing next?
Well, it sounds like he wanted to be a little bit more aggressive throwing the football, and it came from up top, not to be in the second half of the season. And that's really unfortunate because, Wilson was, and even on a per pass basis was producing. Among, the league leaders at the quarterback position. I know he'll be overshadowed by the Aaron Rodgers of the world, the Josh Allens. It's so hard to say that. The Josh Allens of the world, and as well as Brady and even guys like Mayfield at the end of the season played a lot better than he did. So, I would probably, find a coordinator who, wants to tip the pass balance scale further into the place of the best players on the team, with Wilson and Metcalf and Lockett. I would also look towards, getting more wide receivers into the building. Lockett is a terrific player. His splits first half and second half of the year, the last 2 years have been pretty stark in that I think he sort of breaks down at the end of the year. If you give him a lesser of a role, I think in many ways, he'd be even better than what he is now on a per play basis.
The trickiest part of where they're at now is, I'm with you, adding some pieces on offense, that would make sense. I mean, because after DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, sometimes you get good games out of David Moore. Freddie Swain, all things considered, considering this is a guy, 6th round pick, he gave you some contributions, but yeah, if those guys aren't doing a whole lot for you, and you're right on Lockett. I mean, Lockett, there's been injuries that have taken place, I think, each of the last 2 years, and you haven't seen the same guy down the stretch. I'd love to see some additions there. I'd also love to see some additions on the offensive line. I think a lot of people feel that way because, as you mentioned, the Rams are just a bad matchup for the Seahawks. Okay, well, at the very least, have more of a bump for Aaron Donald before he tries to kill Russell Wilson. But it's going to be really hard for them to address some of those problems. First off, at least based off of what I'm seeing, whether it's over the cap or Spotrac, not the best situation, at least for the Seahawks, as far as some of the contracts that they have on the defensive side of the football. I guess you can extend some guys and maybe free up a little bit of extra space, but with Carlos Dunlap and Bobby Wagner and Jaron Reed, that's a lot of cap space dedicated to a couple of guys. That might make it difficult for you to get in a bidding war in free agency. And then in the draft, I mean, of course, you don't have a 1st or a 3rd round pick. So that next step is really going to be curious because it's not, of course, just what you do at the offensive coordinator spot, but it's also like, okay, well, who are you going to be able to bring in as reinforcements?
Yeah, I think you're 100% right there. Look, the cap's about to be 180 million. It sounds like they're at least beneath that, which is more than you could say for a lot of teams. The other thing that's helpful is, especially at the guard position, you look at some of the teams that are paying guards a lot of money. So left guards, Joe Tooney, that's a bad Patriots offense. Andrew Norwell, that's a bad Jaguars offense. Andres Pete is a bad guard, but he makes a decent amount of money for the Saints. Saffold, okay, the Titans are fine. Marpet, okay. Brown, Batonio, but paying guards a lot of money is generally speaking not, the best move. And you can, Mike Upati, a guy that started for the Seahawks at times, $2.5 million, like those aren't the most expensive things in the world, especially when they come, sort of as, dart throws. You hit on a couple of those guys, you make a scheme that protects them more than they protect Wilson. I think the way out's fine. The nice thing that Seattle has going for it this year is, as far as free agency, is there's a lot of wide receivers available. And, the thing about Lockett that's frustrating is he plays all the games, and he's tough. You can clearly see that. It's just that, maybe take 300 snaps off of him next year, and maybe he's, more able to carry the load, in the second half of the season, as well as he has been in the first half of the season, where he's been, brilliant, one of the top receivers in all of football.
Do you think the Seahawks are going to view it that way? Because I think that's the big question about this offseason. First off, how do they view their current situation? Obviously, it sounds like they want to prioritize running the football more efficiently, whatever that means going forward. And also, I mean, when you have a 1-2 wide receiver tandem in DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, no matter how Lockett might finish up the year, that does seem like one of the best 1-2 combinations in the league. And you could probably talk yourself into some of the guys that are lower on the depth chart, even if that's not exactly the best thing to do. Do you think that they're going to look at things the way that you do?
Probably not. and it's an old relic, right? I mean, you think back to the old days of the Seahawks, and that's all they needed. Like, Darrell Jackson and Corn Robinson, right? And then then it was Deion Branch, and then they only back, even when the Seahawks were really good, they had a number of good wide receivers. But back in the day, 2 wide receivers was sufficient, and your third guy was kind of this guy that just came off the bench and played in the slot for 13 downs a game and would pick up a first. Like, now that third guy has to be a player for you. I mean, and the teams that can't even look at, like, Minnesota, who's generally speaking has a great offense, 2 elite wide receivers in Thielen and Jefferson. And back in the day, it was Diggs and Thielen. They haven't had a third wide receiver in years. And even though they're a good passing offense, they're not like an elite football team, because they can't go at you when another team makes you play left-handed. Look at the teams that are in the championship round right now. Green Bay is kind of a different breed in the sense that they only really have one receiver. But, Kansas City goes at you with Kelsey, Hill, Mecole Hardman's a second-round pick. Sammy Watkins is a guy they paid $16 million to. You look at Buffalo, and they go 4 deep. I mean, Gabriel Davis, a mid-round pick, Cole Beasley, John Brown, a free agent acquisitions. Diggs is their big player there. Tampa Bay, again, Antonio Brown's their third wide receiver.
Right.
So, to me, the opiate of having, like, one of the league's best players, a wide receiver, and another guy like Lockett, makes you forget that the right defenses can push you away from those guys. And if a guy like David Moore isn't ready for 10 targets in a game, it makes you less well off.
I'm curious as far as that side of it, because you just look at some of those names that you mentioned, and I wonder if maybe they thought to themselves, well, Josh Gordon was going to be this guy for us, or Philip Dorsett was going to be this guy for us.
Yep.
And I remember in New England, Dorsett had some good moments, but it did feel like Brady froze him out. So, I mean, he's fast, former first-round pick. What do you really make of that? But that is definitely a position I think they should look at. The problem is, I wonder about the appropriation of resources if they're going to be able to actually do that. But we will see. We've seen a lot of buzzwords recently, Eric, over the course of the last 8 days in the wake of the end of a season. We've heard a lot of people bring up the words cover 2. Perhaps some of them don't exactly understand it that well. And also the word creative, or in different forms, avant-garde, cutting edge, as far as the Seahawks offense going forward. How would you define the word creative so we can stop saying the same damn word over and over again?
I don't even know if creative has to be it, right? I mean, you watch those old Colts teams and they ran like 4 plays, but their quarterback was so efficient, and Brady, even in New England, not all that, creative might be a weird word to say, and that's probably why we're talking about this, but, like, it doesn't have to be exotic. It doesn't have, I mean, you have one of the bluntest instruments in all of football in Russell Wilson, right? Like, you don't have to spice it up. Your name's Joe Dirt, right? Like, he can, I feel like they'd be a fine team if they just went to 3 wide receivers, on the offensive side of football. Obviously run the football, you have good players there, but obviously I don't think you need the next brilliant guy there. I just think you need to lean on your strengths on the player side. And on the defensive side of the ball, the Seahawks have always been like a strong link system. Like their defense has always had 3 or 4 superstars on it. And, getting Jamal Adams, really helped really helped in that cause this year. Obviously Wagner continues to play well. A guy like Quandre Diggs, again, when you look at their salary structure, like he's one of their higher paid guys, if he's worth it, so, I don't know, like on the defensive side of the ball, I do feel like they need to be a little bit more, modern or whatever, but that's only because, if they don't, they risk sort of they risk, squandering some of their best players, best years.
We'll see how that ends up going, and it's a tricky spot to be in. I mean, especially for a 12-4 team that did seem to have so much promise this year, even going into the playoffs. I definitely slept on the Rams. That was probably stupid given the way the history has gone. But every single year I talk myself into thinking the Rams don't mean bleep. You work for Pro Football Focus, and I think Pro Football Focus is a website that is a really useful tool in terms of ranking things, but it's also something that a lot of people don't really get how the rankings come to be. So I was curious as to how that works, and I suppose it's a really broad and general question to ask. But how do you guys put together all of this information, this data, and rank things from players, and I'm assuming even coaches, as far as what they're able to do and how to compare these guys?
That's a great question. I think people have a misconception of us in the sense that like the majority of the people that work for PFF are not like me. Like I'm a little bit weird in that I played college football, but I'm the senior math person at PFF. But I'm not the one like evaluating football players. Like we have a team of a number of people who watch the game and on every single play are giving somebody a grade. And then those grades go through a system to come up with the 97 over the course of a game or the 83 over the course of a season. And that's, again, those people are former players, NFL players, coaches, people who have been with us for a number of years. And those people are not, it's not somebody like me watching a game on broadcast, ending it and be like, oh, I think Mahomes deserves an 83.7. You know what I mean? It goes through a bunch of things, and there's a number of algorithms where, let's say, I'm trying to think of a lineman who if all of his pressures are on third down, he's not going to be as highly rated as somebody who's all their pressures are on first down because it's harder to get a pressure in first down. Like there's a number of things where like we weigh things according to, context and so on and so forth. So that's like one side. That's how like the base thing is. That's where, all of our social stuff is. That's where you go in and, you can have a subscription and see all the grades. And then there's my group, which is R&D, which is sort of then that sort of taking that raw data and trying to produce additional insights from it. So I know one of the things, this has been kind of fun because we do play caller rankings, and they're not public because 32 teams hire us as clients. So like, we don't want to be like, okay, so-and-so is the worst. You employ the worst coach in football, right? Like you don't want to do that, right? Because it's tricky. But one thing we will be positive about people, and Robert Salah of the Niners and Brandon Staley of the Rams are the 2 highest defensive play callers in our metrics. And what we do there, for example, is we'll say, okay, let's take all of the play-by-play data for the 49ers. Let's grade all the players that the Niners have. Okay, if I have this collection of players, my defense should give up 4 yards on this play on average. Oh, they gave up 7. Well, that's below average. You do that for like 1,000 plays in a season, and you get some guys who are like, oh, my team is consistently overperforming their talent. That's a good coach, we think. I mean, there's obviously, this is a kind of a God of the gaps thing too, right? Where like, there's obviously other stuff that happens like noise and weather and all that stuff, but pretty good. The good coaches tend to rise to the top. And then if you have a great set of talent and you consistently underperform, then obviously that's a sign that maybe a coach isn't doing quite as well. And so, we use that to sort of help our internal stuff, whether that be betting or fantasy. We do that as a consultant, for coaches, agents and things like that. to try to see if, we can't help them get hired or get promoted and things like that. And it helps us understand the game better. So, when you go into a weekend like this weekend, that Sean McDermott, Leslie Frazier are going to be a formidable opposition to Andy Reid.
Man, I'm glad that I got to hear all of this stuff, because I don't know if I necessarily had a misconception about Pro Football Focus, but I was always curious as to how those grades came to be, because I just figured it's got to be so hard every single play to get a grade for every single player. I guess I was under the impression that every single team had a guy, and that guy watched every single game of that team and focused on that one side of the football. Did not know former players were involved. Curious as to how many, and specifically, I guess how it's all split up, because the one question I've always had, okay, how subjective are these rankings? Is there like a rubric as far as how you grade? And second, I guess, how do you know what plays were maybe supposed to be called and what an assignment was supposed to be? And I'm assuming if you guys have relationships with some of these teams, that you can actually get a little bit more insight as far as what happened and what didn't. So maybe that question was just answered itself. But yeah, if you could elaborate on all that goes into it, I'm truly fascinated by that.
Yeah. So our the chairman of our company, Chris Collinsworth, like we do games live for him on Sunday Night Football to sort of get him some of those. So when he says, hey, Brady has thrown the ball on average 2.5 seconds on the blitz, like that's us. And to do a game live, it takes about 15 people. Whoa. Because because we do everything double blind. So like, even like the coordinates of where a pass was thrown, this time it took for the snap to get back to the punter and for the punter to kick it, like all those things are double blinded with the reviewer that's following along. And then the grades are also similarly done. But to your point, like there's every single statistic in anything is subjective, right? And we got full appreciation of that in the Kansas City Cleveland game, where that rule that when the ball travels out of the back of the end zone, it's a touchback and not something else. That's a subjective. Like somebody chose for that to happen at some point in time in the world, right? And the fact that like we choose to count fumbles as fumbles and not when we put interceptions in quarterback rating but not fumbles, that's a subjective choice too. So there's all kinds of these things. And for us, it's mostly about, are we doing a good enough job evaluating players? And so how do we do that? I know Ben Baldwin's a huge part of Seahawks Twitter. He, like you and me, didn't get, first time we interacted, we argued, but eventually, we got to a fun understanding and started to like each other. When we were talking about, okay, how do we evaluate these metrics? It's basically about, well, how well do they predict something that we care about? Because, the same thing's true about if I used to be a professor. Like if I'm looking at a student's GPA coming into college, like we all know that's subjective. Like our English teachers are grading our papers and giving us grades, all that kind of stuff. But if that actually tells me how good the student's going to be or what level I should put them in mathematics, do I really care of the subjectivity of that number? But that's kind of like where I stand on it. So to your last question, the teams absolutely help us out. I mean, they ask us, a lot of the things that we make are because a team asked us to build it for them in a one-off situation. So, and then, they help us as much as we help them in the sense that, I'll go and, or one of our graders will say, well, what coverage are you trying to run on this? For 99% of plays, it's pretty easy to see what teams are doing. But for a certain amount of time, it's not. And usually what our graders will do is give a player a 0 grade, an expected grade. But that's just the nature of it. When the Seahawks are evaluating free agents, they don't know what the play call was for the other team either. So it's sort of on the same playing field there.
Man, it's complicated, but I like to see how the sausage is made. If there's anything you could fix with Pro Football Focus, because nothing's perfect, but I'm sure that as years have gone on, that the process has gotten better and better and better. Is there something about the way that you guys look at things that you would like to perhaps improve a bit?
Well, yeah. one of the ones that I know one of the Seahawks writers or bloggers for SI brought up Jordan Brooks' coverage grade, and I chimed in and said, I'm somebody who, when I look at the grades, and I know their statistical properties, like, quarterback grades are really good. Offensive line, defensive line grades are really good. Receiver grades are a little bit dependent on the quarterback, but they're fairly good. Coverage grades are the least reliable. And I don't know if that's because of the nature of coverage, because you're dependent on the quarterbacks you face. And sometimes you face Jared Goff and he has a broken thumb and you look like a damn good corner at that point, right? But there are research projects we've done with some tracking data and other aspects to try to improve on those. To me, I think that would be the number one. I also think you can't go back in time, but there's always been an issue, I think, where we could have done a better job of just as an analytics community. I know, and football's fun, so I get some of the trolling and all that kind of stuff, but like I do wonder, because I do think some people have gotten a bad taste in their mouth about us, if there was something we could have done to maybe be a little bit more educational. I actually frankly think that our relationship now with most fans and media people is fairly good, but it took a while for that to happen, and maybe there were a few people we could have gotten to buy in earlier, but those are, I think that's true about everything.
100%. And that's one of the things I'm at the very least trying to do, first off, for my own self, because I know I'm a stubborn idiot a lot, but also because I want people to sort of just be able to sort of not necessarily come together. I guess I'm not Mr. Kumbaya online here, like we gotta be together. But there's a part of me that wants people to just be able to see, okay, well, this is where this person is coming from. And even if they are a little bit condescending, like Seahawks Twitter can get so easily, this is where they're coming from, and this is how they got to this point. And I'm curious as to how you got to Seahawks Twitter. That is a fascinating road. You played college ball. You were teaching at Nebraska, math. Was it a specific kind of math?
Yeah, so I went to grad school in math at UNL, and I did mathematical biology was was my topic.
Holy crap!
And then I was a professor at University of Wisconsin La Crosse in Southwest Wisconsin for 6 years. And about halfway through my tenure there, I decided to just I was a little bit bored, so I started writing and doing some data collection for PFF, and eventually, I realized that PFF wasn't really doing any data science, and I hadn't done a whole lot of data science in my career. I was mostly whatever this means, a classical applied mathematician. But I started learning some data science. I thought the problems were kind of cool, and luckily for me, it's always luck with these things, right? But like luckily for me, football analytics sort of started right when I was ready for it, and I got in, and what's really fun is the Seahawks Twitterverse is full of really smart people. Obviously, you, and then, Ben Baldwin was somebody who, was just tweeting out his thoughts for a long time. And he ended up with a platform that was great. Sean Clement, who now works for the Baltimore Ravens, again, somebody who, extremely bright guy. I think he's got his master's in statistics or data science from Stanford. We got into arguments over how to properly model football, and now we're good. Obviously there's Mina Kimes, Natalie Weiner. There's a ton of people in Seahawks Twitter, that are really fun to talk to, and there are other good fan bases, but this one I think has been the least dismissive of people trying to understand the game their own way, and my way is obviously going to be different than other people's way, but it's a fun place. And the Seahawks have been a team that I think embodies a fair amount of what it means to really like football, which is they're good, always relevant. They never play a normal game, as Kevin Clark once said. And so obviously that grips people, right? It makes it, maybe, I don't know if it makes it an easier or harder place to be than like Lions Twitter, but it certainly makes it a compelling place to be.
As someone who came from Texans Twitter and is seeing the remnants of Texans Twitter on my timeline with some of my old friends from Houston, yeah, it's definitely a better place to be when you're in that board. You're always relevant and you've got questions about what's going on. God, it was hell. Still is. I'm gone. I left. How would you describe Seahawks Twitter in one word? This has been my challenge for everybody that has come aboard.
Eclectic.
Nice. I like that one. Care to elaborate on
eccentric is a close two.
There we go. There we go. That's more real.
But eclectic, I think, is the more forgiving word there.
This eclectic Twitter. Do you feel like Seahawks Twitter is still divided? I first moved here, and I was told by my co-host Danny O'Neill that there is a schism between, of course, let Russ cook, and that no, the way that the Seahawks have done things has worked, at least in the past, so stick with it. Now, of course, things have come to a head where we saw Russell Wilson get to throw the football more. As you said earlier, it did feel like there was more of a governor on him late, though they were throwing the football more than they were running it over the last couple of games of the season. But his throwing style, I guess, if you will, it did feel a little bit different. Do you think the Twitter is more divided at the end of this season as far as the best way for the Seahawks to win than it was before this year and maybe in years past?
I don't know. I guess I'm not as attuned to that maybe as some other people. I know that they're like, I might just not see the side of Twitter that wants Chris Carson up, off guard, off left tackle every single play. I mean, I think Carson's actually a good running back, so I've never really had a problem with him getting the ball as much as he does. Other than it came at the expense of Wilson, especially now that Wilson has, Metcalf to go with Lockett. That's, I think, where the opportunity cost is. I would assume that most people, now that it's come to a head that Schottenheimer wasn't really the problem, and that was kind of Carroll who, wanted them to be more, run first. Maybe they'll be a little bit more united moving forward.
I was happy about. Happy's a weird word to say it. I thought moving on from Brian Schottenheimer was the right move. And I say that because it did feel like the Seahawks were going up against the same defense over and over. And I'm not going to act like I'm a film junkie and saw it. Of course, you can disguise defenses in a lot of different ways too. It just felt like everything kind of got to this being the same week in, week out. Obviously, that's not entirely true, but the Rams, who are a bad matchup against them, the Giants, it felt like they had, I guess, a solution to whatever Brian Schottenheimer and Russ were trying to do. And I don't know that is fixed with Schottenheimer out of the picture. And I don't know that it will be fixed, but I do feel like we kind of got to a certain point with Brian Schottenheimer, and you kind of had to go in a different direction, even though he wasn't necessarily a failure in his time as offensive coordinator.
Yeah, to me, it's all part of this. It's all part of like a path to figuring out, whether or not Pete Carroll really, and this is hard to say, right? Because Pete Carroll brought Seattle the first Super Bowl they've ever won, and did so with an approach that I think a lot of people who love football, and I love football, a lot of people who love football dearly find appealing, which is run the football and play defense. I think the hard part, though, and it was with Russell too. Like, that's the other thing. Like, Russell is the same human being that won them a Super Bowl, and he did so in sort of like a ball control, manage the game sort of way. And it's really, I think, hard to square,
because he's better now.
The same coach and the same quarterback and the same team can live in a universe where that winning the Super Bowl that way is no longer a viable long-term strategy. I mean, the last team that won a Super Bowl with defense and running the football, or defense and, kind of a caretaker quarterback, was the 2015 Broncos. I mean, every team since then, and you look at all the teams that are in the playoffs now, you have to be able to throw the football and almost at the expense of defense. You look at Buffalo, 3 years ago, they were in the AFC playoffs for the first time in 2 decades, and their quarterback was Tyrod Taylor. Their defense was one of the best in football. And since then, Buffalo has basically just been chipping away at the veneer of that defense at the expense, putting an offense together at the expense of that defense. And, it's positively benefited their team. And I know that offends some sensibilities, but that's kind of the way it goes. If Pete Carroll and company are not willing to do that, I want to make, if I'm a Seahawks fan, I want to make that very explicit, because I'd hate to move on from Carroll, who's a legend, over something wrong. But I'd also, if he is actually doing something wrong and he's approaching the game suboptimally, eventually he does have to go.
We'll see where that goes. I think you characterized it correctly. You look at him after a 12-4 season. Do you really want to go the route of the 06 Chargers and Marty Schottenheimer, where they went 14-2? But you understand why. I mean, that was I made this point today because we were talking about Philip Rivers retiring. I do think that's, outside of the undefeated Patriot team, the best team to not win a Super Bowl that I've seen in the last 20 years. They were loaded, both sides of the football, and how they blew that game after the Marlon McCree fumble and that interception. I mean, I personally enjoyed it, but my God, and that led to Marty Schottenheimer getting fired, essentially. Do you want to do that after a 12-4 season, especially with all the things that Pete's done and with how much power he has too? That might even be difficult. I'm still not anywhere even really close to that, but it's interesting seeing some of the things that I would say I saw today. I think it's Rob Stadden who tweeted that, based off of Kirby Wilson being the most recent interviewee for the Seahawks offensive coordinator job, saying that people don't want to work for Pete Carroll. And I thought to myself, do people really not want to get a promotion as an offensive coordinator if they're an assistant coach? It's a lifetime opportunity because they don't have a whole lot of control when they're going to be working with Russell Wilson and they're going to be working with a guy in Pete Carroll who seems pretty, as far as coaches go, not a hard-ho, and like he would be pretty easy to work for.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, again, it's one of those where you just have to ask whether or not he's willing to sort of compromise on some of these values he holds true, because he's been a coach the guy's old. The guy's been a coach for a long time, and some of those guys can adapt. Andy Reid was never a guy who would have went for that fourth down 10 years ago, but he went for it the other day. And again, I think Reid's capable of it. You look at the motivation that he's able to deploy with these players. You look at that roster is not full. That roster is superstars and a bunch of kind of mediocre players, right? But he can motivate those guys to play above and beyond their ability. So you want to keep that, but you also want to make sure that you're still, on the path of efficiency towards trying to win football games, because the window, like the chance they get Russell Wilson with their next quarterback is pretty small. So the window is his career, and you don't want to squander that. Just to keep sort of like Pete Carroll comfortable.
There's a part of me, and this might be naive and optimistic, there's a part of me that hopes that Pete saw what happened this past season and sees some of the good and takes the good forward with him. I feel we have gotten perhaps too cynical on Seahawks Twitter, where it almost feels like we're looking at, this is perhaps a crass comparison, but we're looking at an addict and we're saying, well, he's going to relapse. And maybe we're looking at it the same way some looked at Josh Gordon. And I guess that assumption, I understand it, but there's a part of me that thinks that Pete's not dumb. Pete has to have seen that over the last couple of years, there are some good things that he can take forward.
Yeah, for sure. And look, the 2017 team didn't make the playoffs. 2018, a little bit better. 2019, a little bit better than that. And 2020 was their best record since they last made it to the Super Bowl in 2014. So, there's a lot good to take out of it. And, what you don't want to do is overreact to, they had 5 losses this year and almost half of them were to LA Rams. You don't want to, and one of them, they were a silly penalty in Arizona away from being the 1 seed this year. So you don't want to take, but at the same time, they were only 3-point favorites at home to a team quarterbacked by John Wolford. So the markets had sort of caught up to them and sort of found out that they weren't necessarily as big of a contender as they probably would have been thought of in week 4 or 5 when Russell was putting up MVP type numbers. So there's got to be some balancing act there. And unfortunately, what I see is a little bit of, and this paper, I used to study sociology as part of and epidemics of memes.
Whoa.
When people are confronted with conflicting information, most people dig in. And look, we just had, today is the inauguration, we've seen this a number of times. So we'd like for Carroll to come into the middle, and we would probably, we, as analytics people, we'd probably come a little bit towards Carroll. But the reality of the situation is most people, especially people who have had success, they gravitate towards the polls. And that's where I wonder if there's an unreachable or an unreconcilable impasse moving forward with his team?
That is a great question. I want to move on to a couple questions before we hit the road. This has to do with other people on Seahawks Twitter. Who is your favorite follow, maybe the most underrated follow on Seahawks Twitter for you?
Man, that's a great one. I talk about my friend Sean. I don't know if he counts the Seahawks Twitter anymore because he works for a different team, and he doesn't tweet about football anymore, but I do think he has some really like sneaky under the radar tweets that are quite enjoyable.
Okay, what's his handle?
I don't even remember if he's changed it. Sean from Steeback, I think.
Sean from Steeback. Okay. You link it to me, and I'll put it in the description of the website. In the description of the video after I eventually put it up. This is your chance to take a shot at perhaps a friend of yours on Seahawks Twitter or someone that annoys you. Who's the worst follow on Seahawks Twitter?
I don't know.
Come on.
Man, there are people. I think, does PFF _ Is he a Seahawks Twitter member? I feel like he is.
Oh, you know what? I'm gonna have to look at that. I'm gonna have to look at PFF sucks. Let's see. What do we got here? Oh, Jacob Easentime. Oh, and he works for the Beast Pod. Uh-oh.
Yeah. I just from the handle alone. Look, if somebody has that handle, they might be muted or something by me, but obviously they pop up every once in a while. I don't know. I used to get a lot more like upset about like interactions that don't go well. I don't. I mean, I honestly, it's part of the gig, right? To be called an idiot all the time.
Oh yeah.
So I actually don't have like hard feelings towards much of anybody.
Well, I appreciate you, once I dug in a little bit, going there. That's fine. Listen, I really appreciate you giving us some of the finer points of Pro Football Focus, which is something that a lot of people like myself, and I'll be honest, there have been times where I've been really into it. There have been times where I've been out on it. But honestly, hearing you describe what went into it makes me a lot more into it than I have been at the very least recently. Brian did this at the end of Brian Nemhauser at Hawkblogger did this on the last episode, and I figured I could give everybody an opportunity to do this. So I guess I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you have any questions for me and Sports Talk Media, and I guess perhaps the media as a whole that I can try to answer?
As somebody who is deeply and profoundly pro media, I don't view the word journalist or media in any negative light. I will say. I do find it interesting when you said you were in Texans Twitter, moving to Seahawks Twitter. What was the most jarring thing about Seahawksville? What was the most unexpected thing?
You laid it out a little bit earlier. It is a really smart fan base, and it's not to say that Texans Twitter isn't, but I know that when I first came, I thought, okay, I can look at football in a somewhat conventional way. I think I'm fairly on top of football. I know I'm not by any means an expert or anything like that, and I have my own biases and things. And I remember first coming in and some of the things I said right out of the chute, it's not even necessarily the listeners, it's the things that I'm saying online. I'm like, oh, dang, maybe I need to have like 3 paragraphs underneath it to explain how I got to this point. Cause sometimes I just shoot from the hip and just say stuff that comes out of my, just pops into my brain. So I would say that's been the biggest change. I love that there are heightened expectations here. I grew up a Patriots fan. I'm an arrogant, spoiled sports fan. And I just like fan bases that have a sense of entitlement because I feel like that's good. It's good to have a sense of entitlement. Mm-hmm. It's good to have an expectation that you're going to be good every single year. So that's, I think, the biggest difference. And it's been fun.
Yeah. And I think I think that's awesome. And, talking to somebody, I've been covering the Deshaun Watson thing for a long time.
Oh, boy.
Houston lost the Oilers, the moment they became ungood when then traded Warren Moon and stuff. And, I was kind of like, well, I really hope, you guys keep Deshaun because I don't want that fan base to disengage. Right. And like,
they're close, man.
I can't, Seahawks, the Seattle area lost the Sonics. And, I think that, unfortunately that, that was a great team. And I think the Seattle will probably never, ever, ever lose a team again, just because of how engaged they are. And, they're one of the better fans. I mean, it's pretty easy to see, and they are smart too, but nothing sharpens the mind like criticism.
No, it doesn't. Or just seeing also horrible things in front of you that make you feel like you're smart. And that is all of my Houston compadres. I am sorry, guys. I'm sorry. It's not your fault. It's everyone else's. Eric, this is a blast at PFF_Eric on Twitter. You got anything in the works for the people?
Not much. I wrote a "How Did We Get Here" article for the last 4 teams of the NFL. If you want to go on PFF.com, that's up there. I'm doing a few statistical draft profiles on players. I did Javonte Williams, a running back from North Carolina the other day, as well as Devontae Smith, the Heisman Trophy winner from Alabama. So, if you go to PFF.com and take a look, man, I'm just excited for. I honestly didn't think we'd get through the whole season, so I'm just so pumped that we're 3 games away.
We didn't even delay things a week. Sort of did, but wow, it is incredible that we got through it. You're right, because you look outside and then you see the news and you're like, oh yeah, this is still bad. He is Eric Eager. Eric, this was a blast, man. Thank you so much for the time.
Thanks for having me, Paul.